When I first started making my own dice, I quickly decided I wanted to be able to make my own masters and make my own molds. One of the things that I noticed in all of the mold making videos I was watching was the molds were just colorless or clear hunks of silicone. They didn't have any markings on them. The only way to tell what kind of dice they made was by opening it up and looking at it. I decided very quickly wanted to be able to put a logo, put numbers on the lid itself, and I figured out a way to embed a colored silicone inside the lid to be able to tell what was inside. When I make molds, I start with many of the things that you need for any other mold. First, you have to prepare the masters to be ready to put them into the mold. I'm going to be making platform molds, which have benefits and drawbacks. For this, we're going to need a pane of glass or something to be able to cut on. Double-sided tape. I find that carpet tape is really the best thing to use. It was recommended as it doesn't cause much inhibition. You need your masters. I've cleaned and those are pre-polished, inspected, ready to go. You need a hobby knife to be able to trim everything out. You need platforms. These are shapes of 3D printed plastic that I designed to fit right on top of my dice. I'm going to grab a 6-sided die here, and you'll be able to see that the corresponding platform is going to be able to fit right on top of it when you lay it down. The wider side of the platform fits right to the die face. The other side tapers in anywhere from 1 millimeter down to maybe about 0.5 millimeter for the D20. When you're placing these on and taping them to the dice, you're going to do it with the narrow side to the die face. That way the silicone wraps around the edges of it, and all of the flashing is going to be left on the top face of the die and nowhere else. One of the disadvantages of platform molds is it does leave a little bit of a raised face on the top face of the die, but I've measured and it's really only about 0.1 to 0.3 millimeters thick. It's very minimal and it's pretty easy to sand down and then polish. So after we have our masters cleaned off, we have the platforms cleaned off from anything previous, we're going to take a piece of the carpet tape and we're going to start sticking the narrow side of the platform down and trimming around it to cut out the platforms and have tape on them. You do want to get the tape right up against the edge of the narrow side of the platform. If you have extra tape hanging off the edge, then it can leave extra area that the silicone won't be able to fill in. It'll leave extra flashing on your die. If the tape doesn't go all the way to the edge of the platform, then it can lead to silicone seeping underneath it and possibly down into your numbers in a way that it fuses to the silicone and part of the side of the lid. That can cause issues as well. So you want to have a nice tight cut right to the edge of the top of the platform. So you'll see that I'm just going to be trimming around it. If you have a little bit extra, sometimes you can take a little bit of it off with the knife, but for the most part, we're trying to trim it as tight as we can by cutting it down against the glass. Once we have all of our tape set on this narrow side of our platforms, we're going to be applying them to the dice. At this point, I like to wear a glove with any hand that I touch the masters, make sure we don't get any smudges or fingerprints or oils on the masters themselves. It's basically just going to be peeling the paper off the double-sided tape that's left on the platform and sticking it to whatever side of the die you want to be the top face of the die. Usually that's going to be the lowest number, but it really depends on your own personal preference. You do want to be very careful when you're applying to the dice. You don't want any of the platforms to be hanging off over an edge, otherwise it's going to be eliminating the benefit of the platform by keeping all the flashing on the top face. You also want to make sure that the numbers are completely covered up by the platform and the tape and the narrow side that you're applying, so that you don't have the silicone that's from the side seeping into the number, fusing to it, and just making it more of a headache to clean up the mold after the first set of casting the bottom. You can usually move it around just a little bit until you really press it on and activate the adhesive. Once it's activated on there, you may have to just cut off a new piece of adhesive if you need to redo it. Once you've got all your little funny hats applied to each of your dice, then you're ready to go to your mold housing and get it ready to pour silicone in to make your mold. In order to make molds, I use 4-inch PVC pipe. I've already pre-marked on it the locations for the silicone levels for the bottom and then for the lid. I'm getting 2 ready to go. I prefer to 2 at a time. You have to have something to adhere everything to along the bottom. I like to use 6-inch roll of packing tape. You need your silicone. I prefer to use Soraya Tech Defiant 25A hardness. You need something to mix in and with for mixing your silicone. You're going to need a scale in order to be able to weigh everything out. You can do it by volume as well if you prefer. You're going to need your prepared masters with their funny little hats for the platforms. For keys, I like to use 3D printed shapes that I've set to be able to be right up against the edge of the 4-inch PVC pipe. I prefer to have keys like this that I'm not slicing into the bottom of the mold. Once you have your tape stretched out, ready to go, we're just going to take the 4-inch PVC pipe mold housings, press them down against the tape, make sure it's nice and tight, and then we'll be ready to trim the tape, put it up and fold it up against the side. I find you don't need any extra sort of sealant or hot glue or anything like that. Pushing the tape along the side and really pressing it against the side is enough to stop any seepage from coming out. Next, we're going to put in our keys pieces that we're going to be able to take out to leave the key holes later. For these, I find the best thing to do is to just tip the 4-inch PVC pipe on its side, lay it against the side, and then slide it down against the tape. Want it to be nice and tight against the PVC pipe and obviously tight against the tape to keep silicone from getting between and below as much as possible. Once done, you're going to have something that looks kind of like this, and you're ready to apply your masters to the bottom of the mold. I am back to using a gloved hand to make sure I don't add any finger oils or smudges. To apply these, I prefer to stick them down against the bottom just by lifting the mold and tipping rather than trying to set it down into the mold. It also lets me press the tape up against the bottom. I like to try to arrange the dice to make the easy to remove ones right next to the difficult to remove ones. This means that you can remove all the easy to remove ones first, and the more difficult ones are more spread out. That way you don't have a D10 next to a D12 next to a D20, and you're trying to push them out with the silicone not being able to flex because you have resin hardened dice inside there preventing it from being able to flex out very well. So just move around and apply all the dice and get them into the position that you want them to be in. Next, we're just going to measure out, mix our silicone, making sure that we mix it for a good 5 minutes. Scrape down the side, scrape down the bottom, scrape off the stick. Many times I hear people tell me that their silicone doesn't set, and almost every time I believe it's because they're not mixing their silicone enough. Can't really overmix the silicone, and we are definitely going to be vacuuming out the bubbles, so don't worry about getting bubbles in there if you have a vacuum chamber to use to remove them. Once we are all set with mixing, into the vacuum chamber we go. I mix up 2 containers here because I have 2 different molds and it's just too much silicone to fit in 1 cup. On goes lid and we vacuum it out until it rises and falls and most of the bubbles are gone. Usually that's around 29 negative PSI or so. Once the silicone is vacuumed out, pour it over your dice. Pour slowly. Try not to pour it directly onto a die. We're going to minimize the amounts of bubbles that we're re-adding into the mold by doing so. Then we're going to go into the pressure pot and we're going to let it set for as long as it needs to cure at 60 psi to make sure that when we cast dice, it's not going to fold in any of the silicone when we do. Once the silicone has been set, which hopefully you've kept the excess of your pour cup to make sure that it has set before you've undone your pressure pot, release the pressure, remove the lid, take out the molds. The next step is going to be to remove the tape that holds the bottom to the pipe. Once all that tape is removed, we're going to push these out of the molds so that we can flip them around and reverse them, and we're going to make the tops. To make the tops, we're going to need our silicone, our tape again to seal off the bottom again, our knife to cut everything. We're going to need our measuring cup and scale. I use talc as a separator along with Q-tips in order to apply the talc. And then we've got kind of my secret weapon here. These are 3D printed pieces of plastic or 3D printed resin where it has my logo and a hole cut out. Everything is in mirrored because when you apply it down to the top, it will be printing it in opposite. I have these inserts that I put in that have the number style on them, I hold them in place on the back with a binder clip, and that way I can swap the different number styles in and out, and I only have to have one mold topper per cast that I do. I keep the number style in with my masters to keep them together so that when I cast that master, I use that number style. These are pieces that I designed myself in Blender. It's actually the main reason I learned Blender. I've got cross bracing across the back. It is a little more dense than the silicone, but it kind of has a lip all the way around the sides to act as a boat. It'll float on top of the silicone that way. The text and the logo are 3 millimeters long, and they extend down into the silicone as you pour it, and taking that back off leaves you with indents in the shape of your text and your logo, and that's what you fill in with the colored silicone. So next, it's a matter of removing all the tape, pressing them out so that you can remove them, and then we're going to trim them up using our pane of glass to remove the excess around things like the keys and the bottom, and make them all clean and ready to go back into the mold. So the first step of that process is to remove the keys. Just kind of pick them all out, put them in something so you don't lose them, and you're ready to use them again the next time that you make a mold. The next step after that is to remove the platforms. This can be a little tricky. You don't want to remove the dice, and sometimes you'll want to peel them out and pull them out of the mold as you're trying to peel off the platform. I find the best thing to do is to kind of push them sideways along the face of the die that you're removing it from. That can be enough to break the adhesive, especially on the large faces like the D6, the Caltrip D4. Littler ones like the D20, D12, those are typically able to be peeled off without too much of a concern. Hopefully the tape is sticking to the platforms and not to the die face. If it does stick to the die face, use something softer like a wooden toothpick or something like that. Don't use a hard piece of metal to try to scrape it off, or you're just going to scratch the heck out of your die face on your master. Once the platform faces are all removed, you're going to have some adhesive from the tape left on the faces. I find the best thing to use for this is simple isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip. Just kind of get it in there, scrub it away. The adhesive melts really well underneath the isopropyl alcohol and gets sucked right into the Q-tip, so they actually clean up really fairly well. If you do have any silicone that did seep under, I use a toothpick and kind of pick that out. If it's such a small, tiny little piece of detail that the toothpick won't get into it, then you're going to have no choice but to use something metal like a needle or a pick. Just be extremely careful as you're doing this because it's so easy to scratch the face of 3D printed masters with a piece of metal when you do. The next step is to trim off the little bit of a lip that shows up at the bottom that runs up the side of your mold as the bottom is forming. So I just press a hobby knife up against a piece of glass and have the silicone right in between, draw it down, scoot it over, repeat until that bottom part is trimmed neatly off. The last little bit of cleanup we have to do is getting all of the keys cleaned out of any silicone that's seeped between the key and the side of the mold housing as the silicone was setting. At that point, we're ready to apply your mold release, whatever you're going to be using. Some people use Vaseline, some people use mold release spray. I prefer just using talc. I think that it gives me the nicest finish on the edges and the pieces. You need to make sure that you get the entire edge of the entire thing because you may have silicone that seeps down around the edges of the mold, down into the mold housing as you're pouring the top. 100% sure that you have plenty of talc in where the keys are, where the faces and the edges of the platforms are. Those really need to separate. You don't want to have excess talc, but at the same time, you really want to rub it around and make sure that you have it everywhere there. Rub it across the entire face. The only place that you don't want to get talc basically is on the faces of the die, which you will to start, but you can take it off in a bit. And then the very bottom doesn't really need to have talc on it either. That's going to get stuck down to our packing tape when we put this back into the mold. Once we've got it applied, we'll just use the other side of the Q-tip and just try to clean off the faces as much as we can. A lot of blowing, a lot of scraping off that talc with the Q-tip. Again, you don't want to use anything hard and you don't want to use anything wet. Anything that's wet may soak up the talc from the places where you want it to stay. You can wipe it down with almost anything as long as it's not wet or sticky, and you'll be able to get rid of that. Once you've got all the talc applied and cleaned off the faces, it's time to push the mold back into the housing. I like to try to line it up fairly well and just look around the edges. The PVC pipe is never going to be perfectly circular, and the mold will have followed it, which means it's not perfectly circular either. I try to find and line up where there won't be as much of a gap to let silicone run down the sides while you're casting the top. Now we're going to take our packing tape and once again put the molds with the bottoms back on the packing tape. This just ensures that if we have mold that does get between the mold housing and the top, it doesn't seep out and leave the mold housing altogether. Then we're going to measure out and mix up more of our silicone, get it nice and mixed for 5 minutes again, just making sure we scrape down all the sides, everything. We don't want anything unmixed. It gets very messy otherwise. Once that's done, we're going to degas our silicone, make sure that we have no big bubbles in there. It's just going to help make sure there's no bubbles on the face later when we apply the mold toppers and cast the top of the mold. Now it's time for the real magic, which is the mold toppers. We're going to prime the mold toppers, so to speak, by pouring a little bit of silicone all over any of the detail we have sticking out of it. We're going to try to make sure to minimize any bubbles that we have caught in there. I feel this is a good way to just get that started. So holding it over our mold so that any excess drips right into where we want it to go. Anyway, we're going to get a little bit of the silicone all over that mold topper. Then we're going to pour it into our mold housing up to the line that we've marked earlier and set the logo topper right down on top of that silicone. When I was first figuring out the best way to get all this done, I would have quite a few bubbles that would be right along the edges of the logo elements and words and everything on the mold topper. Even though I had it in a pressure pot up to 60 psi or so, some of the bubbles were just so large that they would not get small enough to completely disappear, and you're left with these bubbles that are indented along with the indents of the logo topper, which can catch the colored silicone, which we're going to be doing in our next step. So to eliminate that, I found the best way to do was to put the entire mold housing with logo topper and everything back into my vacuum chamber and go ahead and vacuum it out again. It bubbles out all of the bubbles that have accumulated underneath it. It makes them pop along the edges, and it drives out a lot of that extra air to make sure that you don't have large bubbles in there when it goes back into the pressure pot. Here's a kind of sped up close-up view of what it looks like when the mold housing, mold topper, mold, everything is in the pressure pot. It raises up the lid, it lets all the air out along the sides, pops up, pops down, kind of percolates as it does, but it gets rid of a lot of the bubbles. You don't need to get rid of everything. I would say if you get it back down to about 28, 29 negative PSI, then you're going to have most of the fair amount of them gone. After that, we go back into our pressure pot and cast again to make sure that we don't have any bubbles both underneath the lid and against the die faces, so that we have as nice of a cast as we possibly can. Once the excess mixed up silicone in our pour cup shows us that it's set, it's time to remove it from the mold, and now we are on to the third step of this process, which is going to be adding the color to the areas that mold topper leaves behind in the indentations. For this, we're going to need silicone. We're going to need something to weigh the silicone with. We need something to clean up excess that you don't want to have on the mold topper. I find isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips and paper towels work. Some sort of colorant. I find that mica powder works very well for this. And then we are ready to remove the mold toppers and add our colored silicone to the lids. In order to do this, we basically first peel off all of the tape that is along the bottom, and then you're going to have to press it out. This is one of the harder parts on your fingers of the entire process. That silicone really grips to the side of the mold housing. With the mold topper in there, it makes it even more difficult, but just apply enough pressure all the way around, you'll find a spot that starts to give, and then you can kind of work it from there. And work it more and more and more toward the lid. You don't want to press on the side with the 3D print. I find that this, again, is not a very robust sort of 3D print. It's only a millimeter or so thick, so it could easily crack into the silicone, and you really don't want to ruin the mold topper if you can. They are not completely reusable 100%. Eventually, over time, they will eventually wear out and break. You will have to reprint them, but doing this will increase their longevity for as much as possible. Once you've got them worked out so that they start to be able to peek out the top and you've got actual silicone to grip onto and not just the topper, you can get your hands on that and just work it the rest of the way out. Once we have the mold back out of the mold housing, then it's time to remove the topper. You can pull off the clips. The binder clips aren't really doing anything anymore anyway. You really have to try to peel the silicone that goes around it back and work out that mold topper. You don't want to remove the silicone that is around the edge of the mold topper. At this point, it's going to come in handy later. You're trying to break the seal and trying to pull 3 millimeters of inserted 3D printed plastic out of the silicone. It can be very difficult to do. Just kind of pry them up around the edges, very gently, very firm pressure. Try not to be too harsh on any areas that are thin and can break. If it does break, you can super glue it together once, but for the most part, you're trying to keep it in one piece and remove it, leaving the indent behind. You can see here I'm actually prying a little bit with a popsicle stick, just trying to get it to release. Once it actually lets go, then you can remove it. You can remove the other topper piece with the number or whatever insert you might have. It'll come off a lot easier now that the rest of it is off. That'll leave you with the indents in the silicone in the shape of whatever it is you want color to go into, which means you can mix up colored silicone and press it into those indents and let that cure, and then you will have color on your topper piece. Here's a little view of what it looks like with the indent in it and everything else removed. You want to leave that lip and everything at this point. Don't remove anything. It's all going to come in handy later. There's a little lip of silicone on this between the insert and the topper. We're going to leave that for now because if we dig that out, it could get filled in with colored silicone, and we want to avoid that. Next, we're going to mix up a small amount of silicone. When you're mixing a very small amount of silicone, I really highly advise doing it by weight and using a gram scale to some high precision. Here I'm only mixing up about 8 grams of silicone, so 4 grams of each part. I try to get it within 1% or so, which means 0.04 grams is the target that I'm going for, one direction or the other being off. Once you have that, you can get the mica powder and mix it in. You want a good healthy amount of mica powder in this. It's not going to be very thick, even though you've got 3 millimeters of depth in those indents. The top portion that's going to be cleaned off when you clean off the excess from the top. So you really want to make sure this mica powder is strong enough that this color is visible through it. At that point, we're going to take the mica powder with the silicone and we're going to start pressing it into the actual mold. All you really have to do at this point is let it run down in there. I don't have a lot of this mixed up. I intentionally use a small amount of silicone because otherwise I need a bunch more mica powder. This lets you just kind of run everything into all the letters, all the logo. I like to leave a little bit of extra on the top at first because we're going to be running this through the vacuum chamber to get out any excess bubbles. That's going to allow us to make sure that we don't have bubbles underneath and take off too much of the mica powdered silicone later when we clean off the top layer from the excess that is left over from the process. Now we are taking a trip back into the vacuum chamber where we can get out most of the bubbles that are in the letters and logos and all that kind of stuff. That's why I leave a little extra of the colored silicone on top, let it get in there after the bubbles leave. No reason to let it in there until the bubbles stop. That would be probably forever. I've never had it in there long enough to know, but really at this point we're just trying to get the mica powdered silicone down into these grooves as deeply as we can. Next, we are going to be cleaning off the colored mica powder silicone from the top that is not in there as much as we can. For that, I like to first use a craft stick and scrape it along the top. I don't press down into the silicone very hard. I'm mostly just drawing at the top with firm pressure down to make sure I get as much of it off as I can. Once I have as much of that off as I can, I'm going to switch over to using isopropyl alcohol on a bit of paper towel, wipe it across the top, once again, not pressing down. We're not trying to remove the silicone with the mica powder in it from all of the grooves. We're just trying to get it off of the faces where it's not recessed. Some people might prefer to have it there. If you leave a thin layer, it'll give it kind of a sheen overall of that same color. I tend to find that that makes it harder to read, so I try to clean it off as much as I possibly can. Some of the areas where you're going to want to pay a lot of attention are going to be around any lips between any inserts in the topper piece, like where I have my number style, around the outside of the whole thing. The colored silicone can gather there, and you're going to be able to see that if you don't trim it all out. So that's where I do press down a little more, since it's not right next to where I want silicone to be anyway, and just get rid of it as much as I can. I'll switch over to Q-tips at some point here as well, and just try to get all of those areas. If any of that colored silicone ran down the side while you were scraping it off, you're going to want to get rid of that too. Otherwise, that's going to set on there, and you're going to have drips of brightly colored silicone running down the outsides of your mold. And again, that might be something you like to have. There might be some art to that, but I look for the very clean, kind of pristine look as much as I can. So I will clean off all of this excess as much as I. If you have some areas where you've pulled out a bit too much, these larger areas kind of get scraped off a little more. Here I have an eye where I must have taken off a bit too much. Try to dribble it back in. You can get some on the craft stick, and if you just barely touch it to the silicone that's wet, it'll draw it down into it, and that way you can kind of top off these areas that are a little larger, and it just makes them look a little more vibrant for a finished product. After you dab it all in there, you're probably going to have to take your Q-tip and isopropyl alcohol and just kind of clean up around the edges again where your craft stick touched. But it's how much effort you want to put into it at this point. How clean of a look do you want? There's, like I said, a lot of art that could go into this, so that's really up to you. Once you're done with that, then you can kind of see what the finished product looks like here. I've got as much of it as I possibly cleaned off. Any of this edge you do want to leave unless it's so thin that it can get trapped in there. But at this point, I'm going to sit and let it completely cure. Once it's completely cured, now it's time to pour the top, so that's the fourth step. I'm cleaning off only the areas of this edge where it's so thin that it could fold over on itself and end up being stuck into this top layer of silicone that I'm going to add. I'm going to leave the rest of this outside edge there. It's going to help contain that top layer of silicone as well. The next step I'm going to do here, any areas where you had to completely remove it, it might run down the side. So I add a little bit of talc right there so that I can kind of peel that off later like a skin if I need to. And then it's going to be just mixing up some of the silicone and pouring it at the top. I think when I do this part, it ends up being about 10 grams of total silicone per mold. So with 2 molds, I'm mixing up 10 grams of each side. Mix it really well, and you can pour it on, and you'll see what that looks like. I'm also going to be removing the flash here between the insert piece with my number style and the topper itself. We don't want to have that sticking up through the silicone. You can really kind of dig into it here. I'm using a cuticle trimmer to trim around and dig down into it, make like a V-shaped groove all the way around it. If you have any spots where you missed cleaning off the colored silicone, you can use a cuticle trimmer and just trim that off too. You can get a little deep into the lid here. You're only going to end up going down maybe a millimeter or 2. It's a fairly thick lid. I have a 1/2-inch lid of silicone, and it's all going to get filled in with clear silicone, so you won't even be able to see these grooves later. Now I'm going to mix up my silicone. As I mentioned, I do about 20 grams of silicone here. Once again, mixing it for a good 5 minutes to make sure that it's all really, really well set, scraping down the bottom, scraping down the sides, scraping down the stick. I will put this into the vacuum chamber. When it's in the vacuum chamber, I'm going to let it completely gas out as well because I want this to be as clear as possible. And then these are all going to go back into the pressure chamber when I'm done. After that, you're going to be pouring this clear silicone on top of these molds. I use a little bit of duct tape to clean off any fuzzies or pieces of silicone that I might have left on there, just to get them nice and clean. And then we're going to be pouring this silicone on top to just kind of give ourselves a glaze layer. It's very similar to when you pour epoxy on the top of a table that you sanded down. It'll fill in all the little imperfections and grooves and give you a nice glossy layer on top because it'll be open to the air. It'll level itself out and you will have a very, very translucent, very, very clear lid that will cover up all of your colored silicone and give you a nice gloss finish when you're done. I use the mixing stick to kind of push it all the way to the edge. You can see that's the reason I left this lip in here. I wanted to make sure that I could press all the way up to the edge. Anywhere where we don't have the lip, I go right up to the edge, try not to draw it over. We're only really adding a thin layer here, just thick enough that it will level itself out and look nice and flat and smooth. And once we're done with that, it's going to be right back into the pressure pot. This really isn't for any sort of structure. I don't think any bubbles in here would cause any sort of warping in the lid, but I do want it to be as crystal clear as possible. So we are going to make sure that any remaining micro bubbles that are in there are compressed down to the point where you can't see them at all. And that's going to give us the clarity that we want to see the logo through it. Once our dump cup has shown us that we are all set with silicone, we are now done to take them out. We are going to then finish them off and make them as pretty as possible for everyone who wants to be able to use one. Here's our look. Again, we've got that nice clear top that's got a very glossy sheen to it from being open in the air. Now we're going to trim off all of that extra lip around the edge, just to give it as nice of a finished beveled edge as we possibly can. And once we've cleaned up that lip, it's time to open the mold. So you can kind of see here a little bit of that skin that's left from the silicone that dribbled down between the mold and the mold housing. That's why we added talc all around the sides. It lets us kind of peel that off like a skin. Sometimes you really have to pull a little bit hard when you use talc. I've heard that if you use something like a mold release spray, it can give you a nice, easy way to open. I kind of feel like it's a little bit satisfying. However, I'm basically at this point ripping the silicone along micro perforations that the talc leaves behind, and it lets all of that silicone kind of cleanly rip. I feel it gives a very, very clean look. It's very matte, kind of nice in the areas between the dice. Really doesn't matter as much to the actual finished product of the dice, but at this point I've invested so much time and effort into making the mold look as nice as possible that I want all of the mold that I can to look as nice as possible. The next step is going to be to just trim off this excess skin of silicone that's going to be draping down the edges that was between the mold housing and the mold as that second step of the lid was being cast. Just use a razor blade right up against your glass pane, and you can very quickly just trim off all of this excess silicone skin that kind of hangs off the edges of the mold lid. At this point, we're going to be pushing our dice out of the mold. So we're just going to sit there and remove all of these masters from the mold. You will have a little bit of tearing around the corners of the platformed edges for things like the D20. I can't find a way around that. I use a fairly firm silicone. Maybe a softer silicone would give a little more, but it also wouldn't be quite as durable, I feel. There's really no way around it, but it really doesn't affect the finished product at all. You're already going to be sanding down that top face from that raised edge. Every other face of the dice should be perfect and great because nothing else is going to have any flashing on it, just that top edge. So if that top edge has a little extra flashing around the corner of that raised mold, it's all going to be gone anyway. As long as your numbers don't rip out, you can continue to use the mold even if the corners of the dice start to tear out just a little bit. And there you have it. You have a mold with a logo or whatever you want to add to the top, and it flexes with it, and it's durable, and it's going to be there as long as the mold lives.